Hello, this is Dan Humberg with HarvestFires.com. I'm going to show you a video clip that is the computer model for the tin kit on a Case 8240 or 8250 model combine. I'm going to step through that. I think this would be a good precursor to bending and folding the tin, so I would hope that people would watch this video first, perhaps. It shouldn't be real long, but it'll kind of show the layout of the tin and some of the individual pieces that we'll talk about. And also it'll show some changes that have been made so that if the tin kit you get doesn't match this exactly, um, you'll know why. Eventually, I think both the video that shows how to fold the tin and this should match completely, but right now the folding tin video is a little bit older, and so it's a previous version of the tin. Um, What you're looking at is the CAD model or computer-aided design model of the tin pieces that make up the enclosure around the exhaust system. If I rotate this like this, you're looking down on top of the engine and the exhaust system. Let's see if I can get it oriented the way that you would normally look, straight down, about like that. The engine would be up above this assembly, and your exhaust manifold would run lengthwise from one end of this to the other. The turbocharger exhaust turbine is right underneath here. The hole shows the point where our air will enter and blow onto that exhaust turbine. And then there's a section here that will enclose the exhaust as it leaves the turbine and goes through kind of a controlled choke assembly. And then eventually that exhaust will turn and go up through a pipe up here into what looks like a muffler, but it's actually a diesel exhaust catalyst. And that's where our enclosure ends. Our hope is to come tightly up against that enclosure so that we don't lose a lot of air before that. Anyway, I want to step through the individual parts of the tin kit here. If we look at this end, I'll zoom in a little bit. Um, this gray piece here, by the way, each piece of tin is shown with a slightly different color just to make it easier to see in the CAD model. This gray piece here is probably the first piece that you'll install. It's kind of the end cap around the exhaust manifold, and then this next blue piece will go and slide attached to that or with that. Those two may be able to go in at the same time, or they may have to be slipped in place and then screwed together. You can see the screw holes here in the CAD model that will help put them together. There's some on the front and there's some on the bottom. So those two pieces, and then there's a third piece here. They're relatively small pieces because it's a really tight environment back in there and you can't get a big chunk in there all at once, so we have to put it together in pieces. But those are the first three pieces that cover the left end of the manifold. There's also this little tab underneath. Once you get those in there, there's a bracket that supports I think it's a coolant line or something like that, that is screwed on or bolted onto the block here. And you can loosen that a little bit. It's a 13 millimeter socket would be what it would take to loosen it, 8 millimeter bolt. If you loosen that a little bit, you can slip this slot in this tab behind that so that it captures it under there. And then there are 3 screw holes in the bottom that would, if we get it in the right spot, those holes will line up with holes in the blue piece behind it. You could screw that together or screw it on there and then tighten the bolt back down here, and it'll hold this whole end of the assembly tight against the block on the bottom side. We have holes on the top of the whole assembly that bolt to the block above the manifold. You only really need about 3 of these. You don't need to do all of them, but they're there in case you decide to choose a different hole. So those are the first 3 pieces. Brings us to here. The next one is this fourth piece, this gray piece underneath, and that is probably the hardest piece in the kit to get in place. It will eventually work up underneath from the bottom in a certain way, and I can't tell you off the top of my head here. I don't remember. I know it took me a while doing an install to make the video to figure out how to snake it up in there and get it in place. But it will slip up in and slip on top of the tab from this one behind there, and you can screw it on or screw it together with the others. One of the things about that piece is that it has to fit around the pressure line that is the serves the turbocharger bearing. It carries oil to the turbocharger, and sometimes when you slide that in there, we find that oil line doesn't go through the center of this opening, and you want some clearance on it all the way around that oil line. We don't want to rub on it or abrade that oil line in any way. And so you may have to slide it, get this piece in there, and then if it doesn't fit with a little clearance around here, you may have to take it back out and bend or open these up. There are some little slots cut and tabs so that you can open it up if necessary. You may end up doing that and fitting it 2 or 3 times before you decide it's got the right amount of clearance and you can put that piece in. Actually, probably before that piece, we'd put in these 2 ends of the around the exhaust turbine. I should have talked about those first. After we get these first 3 around the manifold, then this piece here will slip in and screw with. You may not be able to reach all 3 of these screws. You can probably reach at least 2 of them with a long screwdriver, and screw that onto this exhaust manifold cover. The bottom piece here will slip up around the turbocharger bearing and split the exhaust turbine from the compressor turbine, and that one will overlap here, and there are 2 screw holes here and here, and you can usually get screws through from, usually it's from the inside, from the right to the left, when the rest of this thing isn't on yet, and you can put a screw through there. I don't think you can get the screws through from the left side because the compressor turbine is in the way. But we get those in place, and then we can do this one that we talked about underneath here, slide that in place. Once you have the right amount of clearance here and you can get that slid in place, there's screws 1, 2, 3, 4 here that you could put that together with. Again, these back here, they're underneath, behind. If I look through this hole, you can see them down here. You may be able to get a screw in here from this, right from the direction we're looking, kind of with a long screwdriver. It's probably unlikely that you'll get screws in both of those. This one, the lower one here where my cursor is actually meant to be screwed on from the back side. If I roll it around the back side, you can reach behind there possibly and get that screw put in. Anyway, that's one of the toughest pieces of the kit to get in place, is that one. Once we have that one on, you can put this pan on that goes on the bottom around the bottom of the compressor exhaust turbine. That one's not terribly difficult to put in, but it does have the cutout here for the oil drain line from the turbocharger bearing. And again, there's some little pedals cut here so that if it doesn't have enough clearance, you can bend some of these open a little bit with a pliers, and test fit it to make sure that it clears that line that drops down from the turbocharger bearing. Once that fits around there and you can slide it in from right to left, then you can get the screw holes to line up and shoot screws through from underneath here. Sorry. Then you can put screws underneath here and screw that together mostly from the bottom up, although there are some screw holes that are easier that can be hit from the top down. If we look down in through here, a couple of these down here will actually go through from the inside to the outside instead of the other way around. So that's the bottom piece underneath the turbocharger. Then this darker blue piece goes on from the side. That'll slip in place and screw in both from the bottom and some from the bottom and some screws from the top. You can always tell the larger hole is where the screw is intended to go through first, and then the smaller hole in the back is where it's supposed to bite in. So you can, if you look at the size of the holes, you can tell whether that screw is supposed to go through from one side or the other. Okay, after that one, there are 2 pieces. Nope, it's 1 piece here now. This long piece that goes underneath the exhaust manifold, and none of this stuff is in here yet when you're doing your assembly, so it's easier to see than it is right now. But that long piece will go underneath the exhaust manifold, screw here, those two screw holes, screw to that one that was such a challenge to get in there, and it'll kind of completely go underneath the exhaust manifold to the far end of the manifold. Once we have that one in place, it's possible to put this piece that's highlighted now in there. It'll slip in place and it will overlap with a tab on this piece, and it'll overlap a tab here, and it'll also overlap on the top with the long piece we just put in. And you can put screws in through that one to hold it in place here and up here, and then later we'll add this on. That piece we can actually see down through this hole too. Sorry. Once we have this piece, and these in place, you can slip this, probably this dark blue one next. That one would slip in place and it'll screw to the long chunk underneath the exhaust manifold here, and it'll also screw with these three holes here to this, this gray piece. And then once that's in place, this bottom panel will slide in then we can slide this bottom panel here in place. It'll slip from the outside here in underneath around the supports and stuff that go through these slots or holes and overlap the previous pieces. And then they'll screw together with those other pieces. Again, we don't have this panel on here and we don't have this end on yet. But now I've got something underneath and the back side is all pretty much covered. Once we have that much on, we can come to the right-hand end. And this is one of the things that has changed now on this tin kit from the previous one. I've made a single end piece here. The goal was here, it may be difficult to slide that piece in place. I'm hoping that it'll slide up from the bottom, but the idea was, rather than have several pieces in there and it's so difficult to get to this end of it to put screws through, we'd redesign it so that this end piece would go in and all of the screws would go through from this side, the left side, or from the bottom up, or from the top to hold it on here, so that we don't have to try to get here on the end, because there's a whole bunch of stuff there in the combine that is in the way and you can't get in to put screws in. So in place of a couple of pieces in the previous tin kit, which you could still have, but in the newer ones, it's going to be a single piece here, and that will replace those two end pieces from the prior design and hopefully be easier to assemble. So we can put that piece on and screw it on under here through that piece, and the bottom has some tabs on that will bend, and you may have to do some of those bends after it's kind of in place. They fit around a bracket, a support bracket that comes through here to support the exhaust pipe. And so this tab where the cursor is and this tab here, I think this one with the holes you can probably bend ahead of time. This one you may need to bend in place once you actually have the piece kind of in there, and then it'll fold underneath. So that's the end. Once we have the end kind of in place, you can put this purple piece in here. That will slide in behind this tab and underneath. I don't think, I'm trying to think where, no, it doesn't. It actually overlaps the tab there. So it should just slip underneath this tab, and then you can screw in place with this onto the end through here. And this big chunk here is all this whole gray front. It's all one piece. Now at this point that will slide, you can slide that in under the tabs and it should fit in here and line up with everything else. And you've got screw holes here, screw holes all along the bottom, along this wall, and then here and over here, all to hold that piece in place. It does have to fit around a sensor line here, and so that may take a little bit of practice or a little bit of fitting to make that go around that sensor line. You could even have to cut this opening a little bit to open it up if the sensor doesn't come through right where this hole is. It should, but then they may move things around on the combine a little bit. They don't always leave everything in the same place. So if that sensor won't fit through this with some clearance, you may have to trim and open up that hole a little bit. But then that piece will go on. Once you have that piece on, there's a series of pieces. The top panel, this big blue piece, that giant piece, will slip down in from the right, lay on top of everything else. And I usually start with screws probably right about here, and then work your way back this way, and then work your way back along here. And as you put more screws in, it pulls everything else into alignment. So you can screw that top piece down. Once the top piece is down, there's a piece back here that fits around the exhaust riser pipe, and two pieces here that will fit underneath the exhaust riser and screw both together and down to the top panel here. So, and this chunk in this little red piece back here is a filler piece because some of the early 9240s, and I wasn't sure whether the 8240s were going to do that too, had some kind of a line that came down and tapped into the exhaust manifold here. And so we put an opening in the piece to accommodate that, but most of these machines no longer have that, or they moved it somewhere else. So there's just a filler piece that you can screw down to cover up that hole, but it just means that we can accommodate that if somebody runs into that on their machine. Okay, well that's the kind of the tour of the tin kit on a Case 8240 combine. Should also fit the 8250. They seem to leave the exhaust system alone between the 8240 and the 8250. Once you have that in place, then one of the next things to do is probably to connect on your stub entry pipe so that you can get air in here. And there's a HVAC stub entry piece that will fit on here with a bunch of fingers, some of which go inside and some you leave outside, to both mechanically lock and then screw that piece down to this top plate. And then there's a Flex 90 that goes on here on the 8240 that will come and make kind of a 90-degree turn and then go into a rubber fitting that will take us out to the back towards the blower and stuff. This hole that you see here fits around a pneumatic actuator that controls the turbocharger geometry, and it sticks out there, and rather than try to box it all in, it would make the enclosure come out farther and make it tighter and tighter to get in here to work on anything. And so we kept the box in tight, but then we had to make allowance for that piece to stick out of there. And we would like this to fit fairly tight around that. So if you get fit around this and you decide that that's not, that you got too big, if you have to trim or something around here to fit that around that piece, and you have too big an opening around there, you can use some of that aluminum foil tape that we'll provide with the kit to paste around here and tighten up this enclosure, because we really don't want air that's blasting from the left side here to go in around that sensor and get to the turbocharger. Similarly, there are other places where we might have gaps. On the bottom, we've got these holes where the oil return is here. And if that gets to be too big, you can always close it up partway with some of that aluminum foil tape. These openings are for the posts that support the actuator underneath the exhaust pipe here. And there's a actuator arm that has to swing up through this hole. You shouldn't need to use the aluminum tape there, but you could if you felt it was necessary to tighten that up. We want the system to leak out of this enclosure, but we don't want it to dump a lot of air out of any one place. We'd like it to flow through and around everything, and then leave in a variety of different places. You'll also find, it doesn't show them on the CAD model, that they're on a different, I added them later and to the drawings, but there are some keyhole tabs that you can open up in different parts of this, probably one out here, some maybe one on the top, some in here, that you can open up, and they would allow some air to exit on the right hand side. Just a little bit from each one is what we would like, but they're designed such that the air blast coming over the top of them should create a low pressure there and suck a little bit of air out of the enclosure at each one of those. So don't open them all the way up, uh, but you can open each of those a little bit to encourage air to flow to all parts of the box and come out. Again, I've tell you in the video about bending the tin that you definitely want to um, put all of the screws in place on the bench. There's a lot of screws on this, somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 130 or 140 screws, but you want to at least run a screw in and out of each one of the holes so that all of the back pilot holes are threaded, because when you get on the machine to do the installation, some of these are really, really hard to reach, and you have very, very little space to get a screwdriver or something in there. And so if you're dealing with that little tiny screwdriver that I provide with the kit, you want that hole to be threaded such that it accepts the screw easily, and you're not trying to both get the screw to finish cutting the hole and threading in place when you can't get a very good grip on it with that little screwdriver. So put all the screws in, or at least run a screw in and out of each hole when you have it on the bench. Also, then you can see how everything fits together so that it should look like what we've got here, except it isn't colored, of course. So that's the tin for an 8240. I hope that the video is clear enough to help you both with understanding like the bends. You can look at this video as well to see, well, how do I bend the tabs to make these parts fit together? And by looking at this, or if you have it on the bench, it'll probably show you how each one of the pieces is bent up to orient correctly so that you can screw it together. So tin kit for an 8240. Again, I'd always tell everybody that, well, this kit will vastly reduce the number of smolders that you're likely to have in your combine. I cannot guarantee that you'll never have a smolder. You can still have a hot bearing, an electrical short, a rock, friction on the machine somewhere, an alternator that throws a spark or whatever that can start a fire on the combine. So it's still possible to have a fire, and you need to still be vigilant, but this will typically stop the chronic fires that occur in volatile crops like sunflowers. Hope you have a safe harvest, and you can always contact me at harvestfires.com if you have a question or comment about the kit. Thank you.